just before we start, I want to say to Harriet Walter, I mean, that was a tour de force, an absolute... I was so convinced. I really want to begin by asking you, why on earth did you foist the poll tax in Scotland? But I just wanted a couple of little details here. James Graham was 7 at the time of that interview. Stephen Frears, 49. Steve Coogan, 25. Harriet Walter, 40. And I was 34. And I think you all bring a different sense of what Margaret Thatcher was to it based on what you thought at the time. Was that daunting for you, James?
Yeah, hugely daunting. I mean, on paper, thank you so much for being here, by the way. I'm really glad for your support. On paper, it looks like the most improbable, unlikely piece of entertainment. It's just lots of nerds trying to work out how to do a successful political interview. But I think there's something about, obviously, you always have to ask, well, why tell this real-life story? What's it going to illuminate about the modern day or our current situation? And I share probably like a lot of you, and probably certainly you, an anxiety about conversation, like how we talk to each other, particularly in the political sphere, thinking of everything that's been happening in the past couple of weeks in America with the election and Elon Musk and Twitter, and just how conversation in the political space is changing. And this felt like an unlikely way in to a conversation about that. But I guess ultimately that sounds really wanky and pretentious. Actually, what really excited me was just the human stories, a friendship I sort of didn't know anything about, a very complicated friendship across lines that gets very confusing and problematic.
More than confusing, probably, for a journalist looking back. And we can actually talk about that. But I mean, in essence, what this was, and again, there's lots of nerds in here, but this idea that what you see in television is two-dimensional, but when actually you hear what actually went on behind the scenes, and a lot of that seems so terribly real. And of course, Rob Burley is, as we know, the arch briefer, in dark arts. What is the value, do you think, now of bringing this story to life in a way that we see Margaret Thatcher differently?
I don't know if we do see it differently, but obviously she always evolves. But what's so curious about her is she still haunts everything. Like I'm writing a TV drama series at the moment called Sherwood, which is about her legacy in the mining communities, and no sort of prime minister since then has still dominated. I find it fascinating that you still have to define yourself either in opposition to her or in support of her, and then the gap between. I mean, we saw Liz Truss. I mean, Liz Truss was just cosplaying her at some point. She was literally dressing up as her.
But the reason I sort of mentioned the idea that you were only 7 was because I know, because I've talked to you about this before, you were obsessed by television then. You obviously came from a mining community. There was a very clear view about what Thatcher was. And I wondered, I mean, you sort of had to set that aside to a certain extent and investigate the evidence that was coming from interviews and conversations and archive.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's I wouldn't presume ever, no one wants to know what I think about Margaret Thatcher. I don't have a right to occupy, I think, a space there. What's more interesting is this idea, whether you agree with her or vehemently disagree with her, about what she brought to these interviews, which I find really fascinating. Like, she really did turn up, and she really did listen, to probably listen too much as she stared at you, and then started to unpick everything that you said. And for whatever else we may think about her, like the fact that she actually turned up to that interview, when everybody else would have gone, oh, do you know what, I can't make it, something's come up. She really, at the worst moment in her career, did turn up, and it illuminated something for an audience. So that more interested me more than me trying to share my own opinion about it.
But actually, the same would go for you, Harriet, because of course, you were on the left when Margaret Thatcher was around. And what you've done, though, is you've kind of inhabited it. You've got the essence of her. It doesn't mean you have to be sympathetic to her or not. You've caught what she was really like, which was incredibly self-assured but very vulnerable in some ways.
Yes, I mean, I think I do admire the way she came back in that interview after we can see she was pretty broken, and she came back fighting. But I think that, I was sort of so unsympathetic that I didn't actually watch her on telly at the time. I just thought I'd throw things at the telly and break my own telly, so there wasn't, so I didn't actually study her then. And then sort of once the job came along was when I started getting curious about what was behind that mask. I was never interested in what was behind the mask before, or in finding out who the human being Margaret Thatcher was. It was totally irrelevant.
But when you found that out, did you bring that to your portrayal, do you think?
I only did what you have to do when you're playing anyone. If you've taken the job, you have to get. I couldn't get into. It was funny, that line where it says, "Does anyone really know her?" I mean, I felt that I could get behind her thinking, even if I didn't agree with it. I needed to find out what lay behind her policies.
And you did so much homework.
I had to do that, but I didn't sort of find out anything more about what she felt, for instance, about other women. There's so little.
Yeah.
There's so little.
Well, she didn't
evidence
exactly
of
have many in her cabinet. There was Baroness Young, and there was maybe one other very briefly.
And there's that one other spokeswoman in the film who sort of speaks up for women, but there's no other channel for that, and that's my burning question in a funny way. But I do feel that we can't go back to pre-Thatcher. We're all Thatcherites. We all live under some kind of a Thatcherite path she took, and you're accused of being, backwards looking if you want to unpick that and start saying that wonderful line about, we used to have communities, and now we've just got stuff. And if you there are so many people who just take that for granted as being what the world should be like and is like. And if you start trying to backtrack on that, you're accused of being backwards looking.
And of course, that whole line about community sort of came out from the Sermon on the Mount, actually, in Scotland and Edinburgh, in front of the Church of Scotland, which was, it seemed so shocking. She was actually misquoted, but it seemed incredibly shocking that it was all about the individual and not about community. Steve, you really wanted this to happen, partly because I think you were interested in what Brian Walden was really about. I wonder now, I've watched this individually to different, and I've now watched it totally. Was she playing him from the beginning, do you think?
I think she was more in control of their relationship than he was. He was more enamoured with her, I think, than she was with him. I think she was certainly curious about him, about his background, and I think there was a genuine connection about the fact that neither of them were ultimately part of the traditional establishment. They were the products of the state school system, and I think they shared that and felt that sort of connected them in some way, and felt that they had an otherness, and that, to me, what was the interesting part of the story, beyond the politics of it, was the idea of them feeling they were connected as outsiders. That's always interested me, and the fact they were from the sort of the lower middle class of this country, which is essentially the backbone of this country, what makes it function, and that they both rose to the top of the professions. That background is, to me, is curious, and what you have to do to get there. Margaret Thatcher broke through the glass ceiling. Did it almost by adopting some of the more aggressive tropes of men in doing that. Then I worked on Spitting Image, where they dressed her up with she smoked a cigar, made her with a suit on. But certainly, I find it fascinating, that idea of being the product of some sort of imperfect meritocratic system. I heard a story that when David Cameron arrived at Downing Street, Nicholas Soames said, "Normal service has been resumed." And that always. So I have this fascination with the idea of especially the people who are products of that old grammar school system, which, unfair though it was at its heart, allowed these strange schisms that allowed people to navigate their way through.
Did there was an article, I think it was on the Mail or perhaps in the Independent, that claimed that you'd said that you'd taken a scene out because it was too kind for her. You'd asked for a scene to be taken out when you were looking at a cut.
I did, yeah. I'm not going to deny it. Because I didn't want it to be some sort of rehabilitation of Margaret Thatcher. And I wanted it to be something which was that was balanced in a way, and there is a sort of, even though Brian, decided to stick the knife in, depending on where you look at it, for either noble journalistic reasons or to save his own skin, depending on your perspective. I think both of those things are true. He does raise his glass to her at the end, but there was a line in there that I felt was too, and it was important that we got the balance right and didn't turn it into some. Funny enough, lots of people who are probably broadly speaking, on the left of the linear political spectrum who made this programme, we were so determined not to turn it into some sort of heavy-handed polemic that we were possibly in danger of going the other way.
So Sarah, you as the senior person, baby Kai, did that actually happen?
Yeah, I mean, actually, as what Steve talks about is balance, and that's really what we were trying to do. And I think James said it beautifully earlier. It wasn't about applying our views on Margaret Thatcher to it. It wasn't about softening it or hardening it. It was actually about going back to the research that we'd done. We did so much research. There's loads out there. If you're interested, there's the Margaret Thatcher Foundation, where you can literally just sort of type in flowers or pearls, and you get this whole wealth of documentation back. Obviously, we spoke to Ben Walden, Brian's son, and we spoke to David Cox, and
who has a cameo in the
in there. And we really did our research. So actually, as Steve says, it was, having done that, making sure that it was truthful to what we felt was the actual story, both between Brian and Margaret, but also in terms of what she was doing at the time.
In terms of being truthful, Stephen, the way you designed the whole business of the two cameras, the heavy peds, all that, was so truthful to the era. These kind of unsaturated, kind of slightly dull colours, it's amazing to think it's only 1989, and it feels like eons ago. You're bringing a vast knowledge of that to the show.
I know, I lived through it all.
How was it for you when you were projecting, as it were, this view of Mrs. Thatcher to an audience who, a lot of whom, will never have actually seen anything of her in the last 10 years?
I was thinking tonight how interesting it would be to ask a young person.
Yeah.
They haven't a clue about it.
Yeah. Well, now they will.
This figure that just dominated all our lives. I remember that voice, hearing it for 10 years. It was a nightmare. But you see how unprejudiced I am.
but tell me, because you shot for so few days. What was it? 16 days to produce that.
Listen, I've been doing it a long time. If I haven't learned to do it by now.
Well, you certainly put your actors through their paces.
His pace is unbelievable, I have to say. Stephen's pace as a director is incredible.
James, I know that you spoke to people, you looked at archive, you obviously spent time with Rob as well in Rob's work. What do you say to the argument that there's a possibility that the London Weekend team were very well aware of just how close Brian Walden was to Margaret Thatcher?
Yeah, it's hard to know. So in terms of research, Rob's book, and everyone should buy it, was the leaping off point, and he'd done lots of that research himself. I always find it's useful for me then to go back and do my own version of those interviews. So he spoke to his producers on the team and his researchers, who were great. It was a difficult subject matter to bring up with them and for them to answer, and I don't think they were avoiding anything, but I think they must have suspected that this was going on. And actually, Brian had late night whiskies with lots of people. He would advise anybody, even if they didn't ask for his advice, he would go and do that. So he did that with Tories, did that with Labour people. Obviously, he did. I think she would call a couple of times a year, see if he wanted to come up to the flat or meet after the interviews. Obviously, the most shocking thing for me is what happened in 1983 when he actually contributed lines to the conference. So we didn't push them on it, but we
best not to. Maybe
it felt like it was just something that was unsaid. Yeah, and unspoken. Yeah.
And of course, it's such a big issue now about if you ever get a chance to do a long form interview, particularly how you address it, how you make sure that you're actually keeping a very fine line, which obviously Brian Walden did in so many. I mean, I didn't realise he'd actually worked on that part of political broadcast. I mean, I should have known that. But I'm shocked.
I don't think most people do it. But I suppose also I really wanted to I'm an unapologetically so admiring of the people who worked on this program, and not just because I met them, but their absolute passion, the pointy heads they called themselves, or other people called them, and their ambition in a very non-patronising way, that believed that a popular audience could absolutely contain and understand and handle the nuance and still should. And I think what they represented and the loss of what they represented is something that's very sad and infused. That sadness is infused through the film.
And the thing is, when Rob knows this obviously because he did it so often, but when you're preparing for a long form interview, the briefing is actually the fun. Right, it's the game plan of what you're actually going to do is such fun. And I wonder, the TikTok generation, is it easier for a politician now to go, I'm going to spend 25 seconds getting some bullet points across and I'm not going to bother doing television?
And I have like some sympathy with politicians who don't want to submit themselves to that, because it can be so easily, it must be terrifying to know if I just say that wrong thing, that can obviously then be clipped and manipulated and shared in a way that is out of context, unfair. So they actually don't even have a conversation. You could ask them anything and they just go, look, what I think people up and down the country really want to hear about is how we're getting on with the job of government, and it doesn't. It's performative. It's a simulation of a conversation. But I do understand why it's so terrifying in the modern age. So I feel like an interesting question we should ask is our own complicity in that. Is it the journalist's fault for being too aggressive? Is it the politician's fault for being too performative? But as citizens, we have a responsibility to allow more leeway and space for them to make mistakes, or for them to not always know the answer. I would love a politician to go, oh, do you know what, I've never thought of that actually. Can you give me a week and I'll come back and I'll tell you what I think about that, rather than going, well, look, what I think is.
Do you think Brian Walden was more a politician all his life rather than a journalist, Steve?
That's a good question. I think, like a lot of people, once he was able to step away from those allegiances, he saw things in a sort of a non-binary way, and was able to just unshackle himself. I think at heart he was something we don't see much of anymore, socially conservative, but economically progressive, if you like, the sort of blue Labour, what used to be called that blue Labour sort of thing, which is a background I'm familiar with. But I think he couldn't play the foot soldier. Certainly, he certainly wasn't cut out to be an MP, because that, he wouldn't have been comfortable, I think, with that towing the line and trotting out the company line.
He wasn't a very good politician.
Well, I mean, good, effective. I mean, good means you're not successful, I think.
But I mean, honestly, Harriet, you've done lots of defining roles, but this will come to be a defining role.
Oh dear.
I thought you might say that. But there's also the side of Thatcher that was about common decency. I mean, this goes way back. But, after Warren Point, when 18 soldiers, Paris died, and Queen Scots Regiment, she wrote to every family a handwritten note. And of course, these are the things you never know about politicians. So there was a side to her that actually sort of comes out sometimes in this, that I suppose you recognise as being of value in a politician?
Yes, I mean, I think that it's so degraded now that we don't, I mean, with the man we're not going to mention across the pond, the sort of, we've lost any expectation of I don't suppose it was an individual decency of hers that was exceptional. I think it was more in the atmosphere of how you conducted yourself at the time. And I think that her, she also went into these interviews sort of expecting to be able to have some oxygen to put her point of view across, and particularly in the case of Brian, that she felt she could trust him to be sort of not towing her line, but on her side in a way that would allow it, sort of free her up to be honest with him. Whereas, now people are very on the defensive, instantly on the defensive, because they know that their words are going to be as
chopped up.
Yeah, exactly.
What's strange is that it's been documented for ages. It's been sitting in plain sight in the memoirs of, bless him, Ronnie Miller, who was played by James Fleet, the playwright who got fired as his speechwriter. He wrote this up, and then it just sat in his book. And Rob Burley teased it out of those memories of 1983. So it's documented, and I believe actually towards the end of his life, Brian was questioned about it, and there was a Daily Express interview he did where he talked about some of these lines that were crossed and why he crossed them. So it's documented, and we found it. I think about this a lot, and actually through the frame of Brian and Margaret, I think what I more realised was not only do we get the politicians we deserve, but actually if we don't allow our politicians to converse in a way that isn't reduced to these simplicities, then that leaves a vacuum of complexity, which is often then filled by the populists who sound like they're talking with substance because it seems so without betraying my politics, if someone like Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage come along into that vacuum of managed moderate politicians, what they sound like is what they're saying is the truth because it sounds so to the point and direct. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's any more or less the truth than what else is being. Donald Trump being the perfect example of that. Mm-hmm. If this vacuum needs to be filled with complexities, because otherwise it'd be filled with populism, and that's just another form of lying, but with more damage.
Well, I'll tell you, but I mean, you know, if people want to. And by the way, if anyone from the Daily Mail here thinks it's some sort of woke kind of airbrushing of it, it's not at all. Because, but I think the line where he said she's worth 100 of them, and I thought it was too syrupy for him to say that after having stuck the knife in. And I thought raising a glass to her, which is what he does, was sufficient without the line.
We spent a lot of time on the archive actually and getting the balance right on that as well, so that you could both see sort of the economic coming out of recession and the economic boom, but you also saw the poll tax and you know what that did. Harriet's worn a red suit tonight, everybody. Noticed.
I can only describe how relieved I was when I rapped.
It's actually in reality, like, none of you liked Thatcher at all, so it's quite surprising that we're now watching a film about her when all four of you clearly don't like her.
I don't believe in, I do believe that people are totally complex, and that's why I could never be a politician, because I haven't got the single-mindedness to judge something to be right or wrong. And I find that, as an actor, I'm always going to try and find the complexity in a character. And if it's written in by wonderful writers like James, I'll go for that, even though, that might make me sort of feel slightly more sympathetic occasionally to her, or understand her at least a bit better from where she's coming from. But it doesn't change my opinions about what she did to the country.
I'd like to add that despite the fact that I think for all the free market economics and the Thatcher experiment benefited a few people very well, it failed a lot of people, and we didn't become a share-owning democracy, and trickle-down economics trickled down so far and then just stopped. And the competition of our national utilities doesn't exist. There are monopolies, and line the pockets of a lot of very rich people at the expense of our public services. Having said that, I think she wasn't duplicitous, and what I respect about her having made this is that she was clear, had a clear point of view, and in stark contrast to a lot of politicians these days who just say whatever it is they think will get them to the next day, and are so risk averse about saying anything. She wasn't worried about being unpopular, but in that respect, Tony Benn and her had a mutual respect for having some clear ideology and not a kind of bumbling along ineffectual pragmatism, which is what we've got now, I think, in this country.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, no matter your politics, I hope you absolutely loved Brian and Maggie.